my speech. So what I'm going to talk about today is to present another hero of the Church of Praxeology. And the idea behind this is we try and find historical figures whose lives represent the values we're trying to promote and draw them out, talk about them, and sort of try to abstract some lessons we can use for our own life. And so far we've done David Henry Thoreau and Percy Shelley and his family. And today I'd like to talk about John Brown, which maybe people have heard about, maybe they haven't. John Brown was, if you don't know who he was an abolitionist who lived in the 1800s. He was born in 1800 and he died in 1859, and he died at the hands of the state of militia. He was hanged, and he was executed as a result of his most famous act, which was his raid on Harper's Ferry, which had happened just a month or so before. And his raid on Harper's Ferry is what he's most well known for, and I think that's appropriate because it was really the summation of his life. It was the sort of what he had been working towards his entire life. And so what I'd like to do is tell you about who he was, talk to you about Harper's Ferry, and then try to draw out some lessons from his life. So, who is John Brown? Like I said, he was born in 1800, and he died in 1859. And I think the best way to tell you about who the man was would just, instead of going chronologically through his life, is just to talk about some themes of his life. So one of the things I think is critical to understand about John Brown is his life is really a story of riches to rags. He was very successful early in his life. His father had been a tanner, and so he learned the tannery business. And he went out on his own early in his life, bought a farm, started a tannery, and became very successful. They say when he was in his mid-20s, he was employing 15 people already, which in those days was a pretty substantial enterprise because the economy was much less specialized. Most people were sort of family farmers, or maybe they were artisans of some sort, but they didn't have as much capital then. So to employ 15 people meant you were doing very well. And during this period of his life, when he was still young, in his late teens up to his early 30s, he experienced what it was like to be sort of a pillar of his community. He was the guy who had a very stable life. He had a large and growing family. He would eventually sire 20 children with 2 different wives. And he had the material wherewithal to participate in community events. He was the guy whose opinion that people respected and whose advice they asked for, and sort of a leader of his community. So he was, for example, he started a school. He was a surveyor for the roads. He started the post office, became the postmaster of his small town. And so all these things kind of, he knew what that was like. It was sort of like he had reached this point in his life, which many people strive for, maybe to get when they're much older, or maybe they never get to. He had experienced when he was in his 20s. And I think having that experience gave him I don't know if confidence is the right word, but as time passed and his fortunes deteriorated, he knew what he was giving up. And I think it was partly a conscious decision in his part not to work to try to get back to that same position after his fortunes had some bad turns. And what you see is his fortunes did decline, and towards the end of his life, the last 15 years, 10 years of his life, he's basically penniless, and he has this large family, but he doesn't have, he's living hand to mouth. And I think partly it was a choice because he was known to be a competent worker and intelligent man. But what you see is this decline in his material fortunes, but you see a corresponding increase in what I think was like his spiritual life, because the last decade of his life, he was fanatical about the abolition of slavery, and that was pretty much what he was spending all of his time on. So there's sort of these two trends that are going on. Now, another thing that you need to know about John Brown, which anyone who knew the man would probably tell you is maybe the first thing that you need to know about him, was how devoted he was to his religion. He was a very pious man. He had been raised in a Calvinist family that could trace its roots back to the original settlers of Massachusetts that came on the Mayflower. And he exhibited all the characteristics you would expect from somebody who's, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He was very prudent with his money, frugal and hardworking, not given to frivolity, all these things. And he actually took it to sort of an extreme degree. So he's the type of person who probably sometimes was sort of irritating to be around because he was so dogmatic. Like, for example, he would take the Sabbath very seriously. He wouldn't let people visit him on the Sabbath. He would spend the day in going to service and reading the Bible and discussing the Bible with his family. Another thing, like a business partner of his once said, John Brown weaves Scripture in and out of his conversation with such facility, sometimes you don't even know he's quoting Scripture. So just to give you an idea about how top of mind the Word, the Bible was, and how much he was thinking about it. And whether you agree with his belief, whether you're a Calvinist, or you have to respect that he committed to it. And it wasn't something that he just lived when it was convenient. It was something he lived all the time. And when it was hard and when it was easy. So just to give you an example, there's a story that I think really encapsulates who the man was, which was told by his oldest son, who's also John, that I think will give you a good idea about the man's character. So for a while, when John Brown Jr. was young, his father had him record all of his sins, and John Brown, like many people in his time, believed in corporal punishment, because that's the Bible said. There's a passage, for example, spare the rod, spoil the child. And anyway, so he had his son keep a ledger of his sins, and each sin would have a certain number of lashes associated with it. So for example, lying, 7 lashes, mouthing off 5 lashes or whatever. And then if he did good deeds, then he would have lashes taken away. And at one point, John Brown says to his son, John, your account is hopelessly overdrawn. We need to settle it. And so they went out to the barn, and he had his son cut a sapling to whip him with. And they go in the barn and they have a short conversation. John Brown says to his son, are there any good deeds that are not recorded here that we can use to take some of these off? And his son couldn't think of any. And then he says, well, do you have any better explanations about why you committed these sins that we can use to lessen the punishment? And his son couldn't come up with any. And basically, finally, John Brown Jr. was like, I'm owed these. So his father starts whipping him, and he gets, after about 8, John Brown Jr. realizes through his tears that his father has stopped whipping him. And he turns around and says to his father, Father, why have you stopped? And his father says, I can't do it. I can't do this anymore. But somebody committed these sins were committed, and a punishment is owed. And I'm your father. I'm partly responsible. And so he took his shirt off and gave the sapling to his son, and had his son whip him the remaining 17 lashes until his back was bleeding, because he wouldn't let him do it lightly. So I mean, it's kind of an absurd, taking it to an absurd level, but you can see that he believed that there's a law and everyone has to follow the law, including himself. And so I think you have to respect that to a certain degree. So from his piety, from his belief in Christianity and God and the Bible, naturally came his ideas about abolition. He believed that blacks were people, and they had souls created by God, and that he believed in the golden rule: do unto others as you have them do unto you, and that we should be our brother's keeper. And so from an early age, he saw slavery as a abhorrent in the face of God, and he fought to end it. And he said he first became an abolitionist when he was 12. He became friends with a young black man who was a slave, and who John Brown, being the self-critical person he was, realized that there are many things about this person that are in his character that are superior to me. So anyway, they became friends, and after a couple days, John Brown saw this youth's master turn on him for some minor transgression and start beating him with a shovel. And John Brown was just shocked by that because, this was another person worthy of respect. And to see that, someone could just start hitting him with a shovel. So he said he became an abolitionist that day. And his whole life is a story of really grappling with the issue of not is slavery wrong or right, he decided that, but more, how do you actually end it? And so he tries all these different things. So for example, he was very involved in the Underground Railroad. When he built his first farmhouse in his early 20s, there was a barn he built, and he designed a hidden room to shelter slaves. And throughout his life, he was sheltering them. Sometimes he would bring them to Canada, or he would move them wherever they needed to go. This was something that he was always doing, and that was actually a pretty big risk because that was a serious crime in those days. You'd get in a lot of trouble for that. Another thing, like when in the mid-40s, he moved his whole family to Springfield, Massachusetts. Springfield, Massachusetts was sort of a hotbed of abolitionist thought, and he joined a interracial church there. And there he met Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, amongst others, as well as meeting a lot of town luminaries whose contacts would help him later as he planned for Harper's Ferry. And it was interesting because Frederick Douglass made the comment about how John Brown acted around black people. It wasn't like most abolitionists acted around black people. He didn't act condescendingly, nor was he overly solicitous. He actually was able to just see through the color of their skin. And this was something that Frederick Douglass remarked on. You go to dinner at John Brown's house, and the children are excited because there's guests, but you're not a curiosity as a black man. And he would sometimes be critical of blacks. Sometimes he would be, it was just, he didn't see it. And you have to ask, like, how did he get to that point? And I think it is because this was a man who lives his convictions, and he knew what his convictions were, and he lived them every day. And a man like that, if he decides, his conviction says everyone's equal, then that's it. That's how he's going to live. So I think that's sort of a telling statement from Frederick Douglass. But anyway, so continuing on with things he did, he moved. There was a Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1850, and it was part of the Compromise of 1850, which basically said if any runaway slaves are discovered in the North, the person who discovers them and reports them to the federal government will get a bounty. This was, hated by the abolitionists, obviously. And John Brown formed a militia in Springfield of all the freed slaves there, basically committed to defending any slaves if a bounty hunter came to try and take them away. And they were very militant. And whether or not it was because of that or some other reason, the fact is that no runaway slaves who were living in Springfield were ever sent back to the South in the decade from the Fugitive Slave Act to the Civil War, despite the fact that it was known as a hotbed and a refuge for runaway slaves. So then a couple of years goes by, and he hears about this wealthy landowner in upstate New York who has this plan of granting land for slaves if they want to start a farm. And so John Brown thinks this is a great idea. Maybe this can be something where if this could take off, it could help the movement. So he decides to move his whole family to upstate New York because he was an expert in animal husbandry, and he was a pretty decent farmer too. So he thought he could lend a hand. And again, just to show you, this was a commitment of his life, and he actually just moved his whole family up there to try to help his community get off the ground. A couple of years goes by, and some of his sons, who are now grown, decide they're going to move to Kansas. There was this issue called Bleeding Kansas. There was a question about whether Kansas was going to be a free state or a slave state. So some people who wanted the land moved there. Maybe they were believing it should be free, and then some slave people moved there thinking it should be slave. And what happened is a lot of these rough border ruffians from Missouri started going across into Kansas, harassing and threatening and sometimes even murdering the people who believed in it should be a free state because they wanted to bring it into the side of slavery. And what happened is John Brown heard about this. His sons had settled down there, and he decided to go join. And they basically got together and said, you know, we need to send a message to these people that we're not just going to let them do this peaceably. The free state advocates, generally, when this would happen, they would appeal to the government, the federal government. And the federal government was pretty much controlled by the slave power. And so it was such a touchy subject that they wouldn't try to lend a hand. They just let it continue. So John Brown and his sons get together, and they actually start doing their own raids. And one night, they famously killed 5 or 6 of these thugs who had been menacing and threatening the lives of these free state people around them. You got to understand, it was so chaotic. I mean, there would be free cities, like Lawrence, Kansas was a free city, and then there'd be slave cities just a couple miles away. So it really became like a civil war. And anyway, their efforts, then this militia grew until he had several dozen people. And their efforts really put fear into the people who were marginally slave, promoters of the slave. So all these people started saying, well, hey, wait a second, they're actually going to fight back. And what happened is they all everyone petitioned the federal government, and the federal government finally decided to come in and neutralize it. So he had some success then. And he became really well known. It was Potawatomi John Brown, as like somebody who just brought fear to, you know, people who were promoting slavery. And so he had a reputation, and that set him up for his final act of his life, which was what happened at Harper's Ferry. And the more I read about Harper's Ferry, the more I think it was an act of just pure genius and originality, and only something that John Brown could have come up with. And only someone who had struggled with this issue for several decades could have thought of and imagined and actually executed. And it really did change the course of history. So let me just tell you, the details in case you don't know. Harper's Ferry, this is a plan that John Brown had for a long time, which was, he always talked about taking the fight to Africa, which meant actually going into the South and trying to free slaves or do something there. But he hadn't really made a concrete plan. But now that he had a reputation, he could go to the people, some backers in the East, who would give him money sort of sight unseen because they didn't want to know what he was doing. And so he got some money together, and he got some people together. Some of his sons freed slaves and other abolitionists. They had about 24 people. And their plan was to invade Harper's Ferry, Virginia, take over the federal armory there. And the federal armory had more than 100,000 rifles and muskets. And they were going to capture the armory and then start going around to local farms and arming these slaves and asking them to join, freeing them and arming them and asking them to join this army. And the idea was that they were going to go farm to farm, freeing slaves and then county by county. And then eventually this army would just be a wave that was going to grow. They were going to go down the Shenandoah Valley and into the Deep South and basically liberate all the slaves. So now we know it failed. They did capture the armory, and that was pretty much the extent of it. Within 36 hours, the federal troops arrived and captured him, and then he was executed just a few weeks later. So it didn't work out. And you might say, well, what's so genius about that? Because it's obviously a failed enterprise. I mean, and what happened is, it is true that tactically it was a failure, but strategically it was actually a great success. So you have to understand the slaveholding mentality. The biggest fear, the deepest and darkest fear in the South was that there would be a revolt by the slaves, and that, in some places slaves outnumbered whites 2, 3, 4 to 1, and they knew if the slaves were able to get a little bit of power, that it could grow very quickly. And it had happened once before. There was this black preacher called Nat Turner in 1831 in Virginia who had said God had ordained for him to free his people, started a revolt. And before it was suppressed, more than 4 dozen white people had been killed. So it was already a very, very deeply rooted terror in the South that something like that could happen. And what happened is, to me, it seems like John Brown discovered this. He understands the psychology so well of the slaveholders that, he realized this is a fault line that runs through Southern society, and all that needs to be done is just to tap it, and the whole thing will shatter. And that's, metaphorically, that's what happened, because in the months after his raid, the Southerners the fear became frenetic about what had happened and what could be coming. They devised these huge, elaborate conspiracies that they said John Brown was just the tip of. That they said that John Brown was the first of many who this conspiracy was going to send down into the South and try to start slave revolts. And they accused the Lincoln and the new Republican Party of knowing about it, funding it, supporting it, all of which is not borne out by the facts. But the fear took hold of them and possessed them. And it's arguable that they never would have seceded from the Union had this raid not occurred. There had been other periods in American history where they had decided to compromise, 1820, 1850, and continue on. But after John Brown's raid, it was a point of no return because this fear had been activated. So that's sort of what happened at Harper's Ferry, and obviously after that led to the secession of the southern states and the invasion by the North. And of course, we don't agree with the invasion of the North was necessary, but it is true that John Brown moved the dial a little bit. And there's a coda to the whole story of Harper's Ferry, which I think is really interesting, which is the question: did John Brown actually think his crazy plan was going to succeed? Everyone he talked to, military strategists, his own sons, and he talked at length with Frederick Douglass about the plan. They all said it's suicide. You're going to attack a federal armory. Of course, federal troops are going to come put you down. Nonetheless, he went along with it. And there's evidence that says that supports the argument that John Brown didn't think his plan was going to work. That he actually knew it was a suicide mission. And he left like these really elaborate maps of the South, and he left cryptic references to his backers, and he talked about all these thousands that were going to come after him, backing him. And when he was captured, they went through his stuff and found all this. And so it's almost like he was feeding this paranoia. And if you look at it from that perspective, which I go back and forth, but if you look at it from that perspective, what you see is John Brown as an artist. And Harper's Ferry is sort of his magnus opus. He writes himself into his own great work of art. And like any work of art, it's designed to provoke a feeling. And what he provoked was this horror of the South, and he was very successful. So that's just sort of an interesting take about the motivation there. So that's John Brown, and the question then might be, well, what can we take away from his life? What's the lesson for our own lives, from what John Brown did? And for me, John Brown represents the possibility of what you can accomplish if you pursue your sense of justice. And John Brown was a man who was pursuing justice his entire life. His own sense of justice became sort of, it ruled and it directed how he lived his life. And I think we all have some certain sense of justice within us. It's a very individual sensation. We all know what that means when you feel completely without power to stop something and frustrated and the fury you feel when you see injustice. But how often do you let that come out? How often do you give voice to that? How often do you cultivate that sensation? Maybe in the past you've felt injustice before, but when you think about it later, you realize it's not really, that was actually a misperception. So it's something that needs cultivation. John Brown's life was a story of pursuing justice. And there are similarities between his fight with slavery and our fight with the state. Both are fights for justice. And in both cases, we're fighting against an inertia, and we're fighting against a refusal by many people to accept that there's an injustice here, to see it. And I would argue that the fight that we have in front of us is going to be much more difficult to overcome than John Brown's fight against slavery, because slavery is very clearly an injustice. If somebody is in bondage and you say every 100% of the fruits of your labor belong to somebody else's, and everything you do somebody else has to approve, that's clearly an injustice. But the way the state works, it's much less clear. They cover it with all these lies and misdirections. And they don't say 100%, they say, 50% of the fruit of your labor belongs to someone else. Or we're not going to tell you everything that you can do, but we're going to put all these rules about what you can do, how you can live your life, and what kind of commerce you can participate in. So it's a lot harder to get people to see the same principles at work, which is somebody else is claiming some authority over your life that they don't have any right to. So I'm of the opinion that, for our movement to succeed, we're not just going to need one John Brown, we're going to need hundreds, thousands of John Browns, people totally committed to the idea of pursuing justice and committing their life to it. And you might think, look, I'm not interested in being John Brown. Interesting life, good guy, sure, but that's not, I have my life, I don't really want to change it. And I mean, and that's fine. Nobody's asking you to do anything you don't want to do. Mm-hmm. But I guess the question I would ask is, what is your life about? What is your life going to be about? What are you fighting for? In 1837, John Brown famously stood up in the back of a church after a service, raised his hand and said, "I, John Brown, here in front of God and these witnesses, do commit my life to the abolition of slavery." He was 37 years old. This was 22 years before Harper's Ferry. This was a man who knew what his life was about. This was a man who was committed to something. So again, the question, what is your life about? And it's not something that you can avoid answering. Every one of us wakes up in the morning, we make decisions about what we're going to allocate our time, our resources to. And what is it? In the end, your life is going to be about something. The rest of your life is going to be committed to something. So what is it? What's it going to be? And I hope the answer is liberty. I hope that's what we're all fighting for. Once we solve all of our personal, we get ourselves financially set up, and everyone in our family is comfortable. I hope at the back of it, everyone is fighting for liberty, because we all want a world where everyone is doing better, where everyone has prosperity, where everyone has opportunity. I mean, the thing is, liberty is good for everyone. It doesn't matter. It's good for the young. It's good for the old. It's good if you're disabled or if you're talented. It's good if you're a woman or a man. I mean, no matter what race you are. If somebody else gets more liberty, that's great for me. It's the one thing that is completely unmitigated good. And I understand that there are issues with defining liberty. What does that mean? And that's we'll be talking about that. But anyway, I'm just saying, make a commitment to it. You don't have to be like John Brown necessarily, but make a commitment to liberty. John Brown, you look at his life, where did he get his energy from? The man was living a frenetic life. Even the last day of his life, in his 50s, he's running around crazy. Well, he's not settled. And you think, where do you get your energy from? I don't have that kind of energy. I don't have spare energy. And I think he got his energy from, there's a term, the psychiatrists have this term called the oceanic sense. The oceanic sense, I think Freud coined it. Oceanic sense is what happens when people have experienced such euphoria in some circumstances that their ego dissolves. And psychologically, they feel that they merge with some greater truth, some greater reality. It's like people who have religious rapture feel this. And soldiers on the battlefield report feeling this, ironically, in the terror and thrill and excitement of battle, that their individuality leaves them and they merge with their fellow fighting force and become a unified force. And I think John Brown tapped into this oceanic sense. He writes in his letters about the millions in bondage that he hears crying out. And, that's a sensation that you can imagine him when he's suffering, when he's having asked for money. You can just imagine him feeling like, we're all fighting together. There's these millions of people who are struggling and suffering right now, and I'm doing my part, like that is an energetic and a thrilling sensation. And I think he basically became addicted to it, and that's how he got his energy. So I mean, that's something that we can tap into too. Liberty, it's the same fight we have with the state. It's the same principle. All these people are getting frustrated by the state. You know, they can't. They're suffering from, they don't have the prosperity or you know, just even boredom. Boredom is a result of the state. And you know, when you start, so I guess what I'm saying is that when you start fighting for these things greater than yourselves, these principles, it's a really thrilling sensation, because you know, you feel like you're part of this fight for everyone who's with you fighting for this. So that's you know, I guess what I'm saying is it's good for us, it's good for you as an individual, even if just from a purely self-interested calculation. And so that's my long talk about John Brown. I don't think I gave it him justice, but I just wanted to read this. John Brown's life was a sort of inversion of the usual pattern, which is idealism when you're young and then increasing cynicism as you get old. John Brown had the opposite. He became more idealistic, more passionate, until the day he died. And David Henry Thoreau wrote this when he heard about John Brown's death, which I think kind of, which encapsulated very well. He says, "This event advertises me that there is such a fact as death, the possibility of a man's dying. It seems as if no man has ever died in America before, for in order to die you must first have lived. This man, in teaching us how to die, has at the same time taught us how to live." So that's John Brown. And